Alrighty, so here's something interesting that I don't see anybody talking about, mostly because everybody's been distracted by Pokemon. But the Nintendo Switch 2 just had probably the worst January that you can imagine for a brand new console in 2026. And it's just a basic continuation of the patterns that we saw in the holiday season, which if you remember when I was covering all the data around the world during that time, I suggested that Nintendo would be facing one of the worst Januaries since probably the Wii U era. And based off of the most recent data from Circana, that seems to be the case. Now, the funny thing is, you know it's a bad month, or it was a bad month for Nintendo, because the way that the news of the console sales was delivered was intentionally left very vague. No hard numbers were provided. All we got was the percentage drop-offs for Sony, and we got the percentage drops-offs for Xbox, and we got the hardware rankings for units sold showing us that Nintendo Switch 2 sold somewhere in between Xbox and Sony. So yes, the PlayStation 5 has actually outsold the Nintendo Switch 2 in the month of January. So that means the PS5 outsold it in November, and then in December, thanks to all of the Mario Kart World bundle discounts that were provided all across the USA, the Switch 2 managed to barely edge past the PS5, and then now in January, the PS5 takes the lead. I've covered this in the past, but the internet world seems to have the memory of a goldfish. But the PS5 is being sold at a base price of $400 for the digital version and $450 for the physical version, which are very similar to the prices they've been since launch. In the US, the PS5 did not get a price increase until around this summer, was it August? And then by the time we got to November, the prices were back down to between $400 and $500. So everyone keeps trying to push this narrative that the PS5 is doing as well as it is because of the discounts, but in actuality, it's not doing anything because of discounts. It's the same price that it's been for the past 5 years. In fact, in this holiday season, it wasn't even the cheapest that it's been. Previous holidays and previous discounts and deals saw it go down to as low as $375, so the idea that the console is moving because of it being heavily discounted has nothing to do with the PS5. Now, you can argue that people are afraid about future price increases, and that's increasing the sales of the PlayStation 5, but by that logic, you could make the exact same argument with the Nintendo Switch 2, because there are a whole lot of people that have decided to buy it over the past few months out of fears of price increases. Actually, this started as early on as last year with the tariffs when the console first launched. So it's not really that important of a variable. Now, the PlayStation 5 sales are actually down in this January and compared to the last January, but if you align the launch of the PlayStation 5 with the PlayStation 4, in the same January for the PlayStation 4, the PS5 has sold roughly the same amount. And back then, the PlayStation 4 was significantly cheaper. It had already faced a whole bunch of discounts and price cuts. And that also applies to back in 2018 when the PlayStation 4 was outselling the Switch 1 in many of the months of the Switch 1's first year. The reason it was doing so is because there were deals that would go as low to $200 sometimes, while the Switch 1 was selling for $300. But the reality is the way that the PlayStation 5 is moving is fairly comparable to what the PS4 was doing. And I am not highlighting this to celebrate the PS5. I'm highlighting it to show people that the idea that the economy and the market conditions are the sole reason that the Nintendo Switch 2 has underperformed over the last 3 months, while yes, it may play a small piece of the puzzle, it's not even remotely the whole story. Because the bigger pieces of the pie are the price point for the Nintendo Switch 2, as well as its software, and in addition to that, their lack of a system seller. This is why the Nintendo Switch 2 saw roughly a 35 to 40% drop off both in November and in December, in comparison to the Nintendo Switch 1's first year. And now looking at January, once again, we do not have an exact number because Circana made this as difficult as possible for people, but the general estimates is that the upper limit is roughly 200,000, which is roughly where the PS5 might sit, all the way to the lower limit being roughly 100,000 where the Xbox sits. Now, my estimates for this were roughly around 160,000 units. I'm seeing others suggest that it might be closer to 180, 185,000 units, but either way, we're never going to know that exact number. What we do know is that the Nintendo Switch 1, based off of all of the Circana data that we've actually have, sold 275,000 units in 2018, 284,000 units in 2019, 275,000 units in 2020, and at least 320,000 units in 2021. That 320,000 minimum is based off of a report from Circana back in 2021 saying that the Nintendo Switch 2 was the best-selling hardware platform in units sold for the month of January, and unit sales of the Nintendo Switch were the highest of any platform in a January month since the Nintendo Wii in January 2010. So I just looked at all of the Januaries since then, and the highest one was like in 2011 at 320,000. But anyway, as you can see, for the first 4 years of the Nintendo Switch 1's life, those January numbers were pretty good. And again, the data is not exactly concrete, but the estimates show that the worst January that the Switch 1 had was last year, where it sold 150,000, which is fairly close to what the Switch 2 did now. And if you consider that that was the Nintendo Switch 1 way out in like, what, the 7th or 8th year of its life, the Switch 2 should not be compared to that. It should be compared to almost every year prior to that, and especially in those early years. Right, like we know that by the end of the holiday of 2017 and the holiday of 2025, the Switch 1 had outsold the Switch 2, and most of those sales for the Switch 1 came during the holiday season. In fact, that's why when you align the launches, the Switch 2 is still ahead of the Switch 1 by a wide margin, because the biggest bump came in the holidays when the Switch 1 finally had ample stock. But either way, when you're looking at January 2018, the Switch 1 user base in the States is just around 4.8 million, as opposed to the Switch 2 being around 4.4 or 4.5 million. So to be going into the new year, the new January, with fewer units sold and still selling even less in January in comparison to what the Switch 1 did back in 2018, that is a clear indication of slowing down. And again, it is not a one-off month. This is something that I've been talking about since the console launched. The peak for the Nintendo Switch 2 was at the launch. That's when it started off, when it had more units available than every other console. Just comparing it to the Switch 1. The Switch 1 built momentum up as it went through the year, and it continued on at the start of the new year. That's why its January was good. It wasn't considered a bad January. And likewise, prior to that January, the December was considered very good. The November was considered very good. But no, what we've seen for the Switch 2 was that its launch month was very good. The July was good. And then every month after that, including the October where Pokemon launched, was like, it was considered a good month, but nothing like out of the ordinary for the new Pokemon game for a new console, followed by record lows of a holiday season. And then it continued to trend downwards into January, where the Switch 2 has one of the fewest units sold in a single January that we've seen since the Wii U days. And of course, the earliest signs of this were seen a mere weeks ago when we got some initial data for how the console was doing in January in Spain. The Western markets outside of Japan have all been fairly consistent all throughout the last year, very similar to one another in their patterns. The US and Japan might be the single largest pieces of the pie when you're looking at it from a single nation standpoint. But all of the sales data and the sales patterns that we saw throughout all of Europe was in line with what we saw in the States last year. High peak at launch, sales slowed down, they over-ordered for the holiday season, it led to price drops and discounts everywhere, and obviously those discounts and price drops happened earlier in Europe. And despite all of those price drops and all of those discounts from the retailers, it still ended up giving the Switch 2 a very terrible holiday season, to the point that analysts and even the Nintendo president suggested himself that the console was performing below expectations in the Western markets. And that has now continued on into January. Need I remind you, throughout January, various retailers were still selling the Switch 2 at a discount. Examples like Micro Center selling the base model at $400. And around the end of January and early February, we started seeing Sam's Club pushing out the Mario Kart World Bundle at $375 in clearance. We saw more and more fears and suggestions that the Nintendo Switch 2 was going to get a price hike and you needed to buy it now or you're going to get it later more expensive, which again is the same type of rhetoric that was being pushed last year prior to the console being available at discounts everywhere. All of this chatter, and it still had one of the worst Januaries since the Wii U. But if you're being as optimistic as humanly possible, the January drop-off from the Switch 1 into this January for the Switch 2, again, if you're giving the ultimate benefit of the doubt for the Nintendo Switch 2, was 20% down. And that's after having a holiday season that was 35 to 40% down. But at that point in time, you have to remember that this last December was also tracked as a 5-week December. So that extra week that could have gone to January ended up going to December. So that means a 5-week December still underperformed in comparison to pretty much every other holiday that the Switch 1 had. The whole 5-week versus the 4-week thing, it eventually balances out over time. But it's only ever brought into the discussion when it's needed to cushion the effect of a bad month. But the reality is, even when you compare this 4-week January with every other 4-week January for the Switch 1's life, it's still one of the worst, if not the worst performing January since the Wii U days, by a minimum of a 20% drop-off. And that minimum could realistically go all the way up to a maximum of around 40. So no matter how you try to spin it, this was a very underwhelming January for the Nintendo Switch 2's console sales. And the software sales do not look much better. We already know that the Switch 2 software is down. It's barely moving. The financials are showing us that. I did find it interesting that Matt Piscatella didn't lead off the headlines with saying that the Nintendo Switch 2 was still the fastest selling console of all time, because if I'm not mistaken, through the first 8 months in the USA, it's still the fastest selling console. So it's very much entirely possible that the Nintendo Switch 2 still has a bad month 8 and is still the best selling console of all time, just like it had a bad previous month of December and still was the best selling console through the first 7 months. But as has been discussed plenty of times on this channel, the only reason the Nintendo Switch 2 was considered the fastest selling console through the first 7 months, and then now through the first 8 months, even if Matt Piscatella is not saying that this time, is once again because every other console that launched did not launch in the middle of the year in June. So the holiday season reached the Nintendo Switch 2 before every other console reached theirs. And I broke all of this down in previous videos about a month ago. And the other reason why the Nintendo Switch 2 is still considered the fastest selling console in the USA is because for some reason we just don't count the Game Boy Advance, because the Game Boy Advance is still very much outpacing the Nintendo Switch 2, just like it was last month. And the reason why the Game Boy Advance is the only console to be outpacing the Nintendo Switch 2 for now is because it's the only other game console to launch in June, just like the Switch 2 did. So the Game Boy Advance also was the fastest selling console through the first, I don't know, year or whatever of its life. I don't know the exact number of how long it lasted, but it was as fast as it was largely because of the early holiday season that it got, just like the Switch 2 has gotten. And I think it's funny that when you compare every console that has launched in June, that being the GBA versus the Switch 2 lost to the GBA, its only competition. And to further cement how much of an advantage that early holiday season has on these consoles, since the Game Boy Advance didn't have a worldwide launch in the same time, it launched in the US in June, but in Japan it launched in March. So right now, the Game Boy Advance in the USA is outpacing the Switch 2, but in Japan, the Switch 2 is outpacing the GBA for another few months. Is it because the Game Boy Advance had a better launch and was more popular in the USA? No. It's because the GBA reached its holiday bump in the USA faster than it did in Japan. But it all balances out in the end. The only benefit of having that launch in June so that the holiday comes sooner is it creates a vibe where the assumption is that the Switch 2 is doing something remarkable, where in reality there have been very clear signs since the console launched up until now of this massive drop-off in demand in comparison not only to the Switch 1 but many other more successful consoles. But of course, launches aligned, that is not reflected yet. But the clock is ticking. And for the third month in a row, having underwhelming results when your console is only 8 months old is definitely not a good sign of what's to come. It might be because of the lack of a big system seller, or it might be because of the prices. I think the reality is somewhere in between those two, and only time will tell which one of those two that it is.